revolutionaries on the left have misrepresented both of these. They've misunderstood what the theory of imperialism and direct nation self-determination actually means. To the extent that they have understood it, they thought that they could transpose it from, say, 1916 to 2016 without any amendments to it at all. And they've also conflated both. And what I mean by that is that they've treated certain imperialist countries as if they were oppressed countries, notably China and Russia. So to sort out the mess that I think people have got into, it's very useful to go back to the point of origin, the discussions in the Second International about imperialism and the national question from the 1890s onwards. It's important to say that in this case, both positions were debated very intensely in the Second International from the mid-1890s. It wasn't just something that Lenin came up with one morning in 1914. It was a substantial book published by Historical Imperialism, now in paperback from Haymarket, of the debates on imperialism from, I think, 1899, and a series of major works, Hilferding, Lenin, Bukharin, Luxemburg, and so on. There was individual problems with all of them, but out of these we can come to a kind of view of what imperialism is, which I think is useful. There seems to be the idea that around about the last third of the 19th century, something significant changed in capitalism. Lenin calls this a different phase in the development of capitalism, but it's generally seen that from about 1873, from the crisis of 1873, something happens in the nature of capitalism that's different from previously. And this really, I think, there are two major aspects of this. One is capital being forced outward, bursting outside the boundaries of the nation state and seeking outlets in other capitalist countries, but also in colonies. And of course, at this period in history, this is when most of the world was being divvied up by the major imperial powers into colonies. Very few states not colonised. In Africa, there's only two, Ethiopia and Liberia, which are not actually colonies. And situations similar in Asia and so on. Although in Latin America, there's what Lenin calls semi-colonies, like independent states, which are dominated by one or other of the great powers. So they're kind of pushing outwards, and the colonies are necessary for raw materials, for markets, and in some cases for investment, although it's also the case in most, right down to the Second World War anyway, and after that, most investment by capitals goes to other capitalist countries, goes to other imperialist countries, not to the colonies. This is simply a mistake to imagine that's the case. That's one thing. The second thing, in a sense, the obverse of this, is two fusions. On the one hand, the fusion of financial and industrial capital. That's finance capital, by the way, confusingly. Finance capital isn't just banks, it's a fusion of financial capital with industrial capital. And the fusion of that, increasingly with the state. And Bukharin specifically calls this state capitalism. Now, by that I don't mean everything gets nationalised, the state controls everything, but it does mean the state takes a sort of interest in how capital unfolds. For example, in Japan, forcing certain groups into single corporations, or in America, splitting them up. Basically taking a view of this, but more importantly, protecting capital that's exported abroad, either through direct colonial intervention or more indirectly. Now, the implications of this is that capitalist competition is raised to the level of competition between states. And this is really important because it's a very, very influential argument, usually called political Marxism, which is that capitalism essentially is about markets and market compulsion. And anything that doesn't fall under that category must be sort of outside of capital or outside of capitalism. This is not, I think, a particularly useful or sensible way of thinking about it. And not wanting to get too Hegelian on your asses so early in the afternoon, I think we have to see capitalism as a form of totality, in which the state and competition between states is just as much part of capitalist competition as competition between individual firms or companies. And it's a kind of competition which ultimately finds its expression in war. War is the ultimate expression of capitalist competition, and the First World War clearly was seen as one of those examples by the theorists of imperialism that I've discussed here. Now, at this point in the world, to use the international relations jargon, is multipolar, in a sense that isn't one single power or two single powers. There are massive different competing powers, all of them of different sizes and different reach and different sort of capacities, but they're all roughly within the same ballpark in terms of their influence and ability to wage war. In fact, this is an example, I suppose, of uneven and combined development. Trotsky says somewhere that war forces the same kind of compulsions on all the participants, even if they are more backward or more advanced. So in order to fight a war, you have to have tanks, you've got to have bombs and so on, you have to have factories to produce them, even if the rest of your countryside, as in Russia, was agricultural and dominated by feudalism. So this imposes the same kind of logic, if you like, on all the states participating. Now, the policy conclusions that people drew, revolutionaries drew, already heard us this morning, was, and Liebknecht expresses it very well, the idea of the main enemy is at home. Now, why he said that was because in the run-up, well, he said it a bit earlier in World War I, but in World War I, was that reformists, centrists took the view that we have to side with our own state because the states they are fighting are somehow worse than our one. They treat their colonial subjects more badly, they have less democracy or whatever it is. But there was always some excuse why you had to defend Germany or Britain or Russia or whatever it was against the evil other. Now, in that circumstance, a circumstance of world war in which people are pitched in and siding with their own governments and cheering people on to join the army and participate in that kind of struggle, to say the main enemy was at home was to absolutely say, no, we don't support our government, we are opposed to our government. But the slogan has to be seen in conjunction with another slogan, which was Lenin's, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And he didn't mean that just in the country he was in, he meant everywhere. All of the imperialist players, the wars would turn into a civil war. We want them to be brought down, the governments to be brought down, not by the enemies they're fighting, but by the working class and its allies within those states themselves. So this is a generalised argument for revolution across the imperial world. Lenin didn't say, I'm in Russia, therefore I support Germany, or something like that. That would be ridiculous. He wanted the German state to be brought down as well. And that's the key element of this argument. Okay, let me say a bit about the right of nations to self-determination. A policy first passed by the Second International at its Congress in 1896, I think at the instigation of the Polish delegates. As usual, Lenin took this more seriously than most people did. I mean, the right wing basically ignored it, as they usually did any bit of policy they didn't like. And it's Lenin we generally associate with this slogan, but it was quite a generalised one on the left and centre of the International. Now, the idea of the right of self-determination is basically that we accept that all nations have a right to determine whether they're independent, whether they want independence or not. Right. However, we don't necessarily mean they have to exercise that right. That's a political argument depending on the situation at the time. Mostly we would, because most of the world, the people who don't have their own independent states are colonies of one of the great powers. Obviously, we support their right to be independent and struggle against imperialist powers, but there are circumstances in which you might not exercise that. And we are thinking back about, for example, Marx and Engels' opposition to pan-Slavism in 1848, because quite clearly the Slavic movement was tied in with Russian imperialism. So to support that would be support one of the imperial powers. So you have to judge it and simply go on about Serbian independence in 1914, when clearly Serbia was being used as a casus belli by by the Western powers. Is to miss the point of what's going on. So you can't simply say, yes, we support all national independence movements at all times. You have to make some kind of political judgment, but certainly the right, as Lenin puts it, is there. Now, I'll say a bit about rights shortly, but that's the general position. Okay, so we're against all imperial oppressors, and by and large we support the right of nations to self-determine what they are, and in most cases would support the right to actually do it, to secede. Problems with this. First of all, and this is not so much a criticism as a kind of caveat or expansion, I don't think it's sensible to talk about imperialism as being a stage in the development of capitalism. It seems to be much more a kind of permanent condition of capital once it gets to a certain point of development, that is, once it becomes a kind of global system. Imperialism is then built into it. Otherwise you're left with a kind of peculiar idea, well, okay, if imperialism is a stage, are we still on the same stage so we're in back in the 1890s, which obviously we're not. Stages tend to develop after crises, so 1873, 1929, 1973, perhaps 2008, although for reasons to do with the peculiar nature of neoliberalism, that maybe isn't a new period. But anyway, crises happen, there's a reconstruction, reorganisation of capital. Imperialism was one thing that emerged out of the crisis of 1873, but it's still with us. So clearly it's not a stage, I think it's a permanent factor in capitalist development. And in fact, you can see, in the way I've described this, of the competition between states escalating to liberal war, in earlier periods of capitalism. Think of the very early stage of the Italian city-states. The only capitalist areas in the world at this point, what do? They fight each other and don't unite under Florentine powers, both Machiavelli and Dante before him asked for. And eventually they're smashed by feudalism and by Spanish absolutism. Or England and the Dutch Republic during the 1650s, the only two capitalist states in the world. What do? Do they ally against France? No, they fight each other in 3 wars, lasting up until the final unification in 1688, really predicated on Dutch decline. So, I mean, this seems to be built into capitalism, that capitalist states fight each other, even if they're terribly isolated and actually still in a very weak position. And after the age of imperialism, that becomes actually quite a marked phase. So I think, and that doesn't really affect the politics of it, but I think, nevertheless, I think we have to reject it as a stage. There is one particular aspect of it, however, which is just simply wrong, particularly Lenin's position about the labour aristocracy. bribed by the super profits of imperialism. Now, in its more vulgar versions, and many of them have been very vulgar indeed, this is the idea that capitalist firms accrue gigantic profits in what we now call the Global South, and then use them to bribe workers, notably engineers and other skilled workers, into being reformists. Right, that's essentially the position. This was demolished fairly comprehensively by Tony Cliff back in 1957, and there's a reasonable argument by Charlie Post as well more recently, which I think exemplifies or updates some of the arguments. Essentially it's this: capitalists don't bribe workers with gigantic wages, they have to be extracted from them by class struggle. And in any case, the people who were supposed to be the labour aristocrats who were being bribed were the very people who formed the communist parties and the revolutionary movement after the Russian Revolution, which makes it a bit unlikely they were the people who were, susceptible to this kind of bribery. The argument has a lot of life in it. It's recently been revived in a slightly different form by a writer called John Smith in a book called Imperialism in the 21st Century, which some of you may have read Michael Roberts' review of it a couple of weeks ago in his blog, where he argues that basically now capital depends on super exploitation of workers primarily in China, but also in some other third world countries, and effectively workers in the first world are essentially given cheap goods because of the super exploitation of these workers. I don't have time to go into this argument, which would involve a discussion about surplus value and so on, probably don't have time for at this point, but it's an interesting book in some ways, and somebody says it's true, but it's used for a kind of, I think, deeply reactionary third worldist argument, which I don't think is particularly helpful as a revolutionary argument at all. Okay, finally, the thing about rights and the right to self-determination. Although I think Lenin's political position on this was largely correct, I do agree with Rosa Luxemburg that any attempt to talk about rights is a piece of metaphysical bullshit, basically. Who on earth would confer such a right? God? The United Nations? Where does it come from? All you're really saying is, we think it would be a good idea if these people were allowed to do this. It's not a right. So let's dispense with this kind of metaphysical talk. It's a rights of man, a right to work or something like that. It's just a kind of aspirational thing which doesn't really express anything. You have to make a political decision about which national movements you're supporting on the basis of actual politics, not invoking rights. I don't think that really gets us anywhere. Well, some people may disagree. Okay, so what happened, what changed the nature of imperialism? There seems to be two major periods of shift since the theory was formed and around the period of the First World War. One is the changes after 1945, when, again, to revert into international relations jargon, we're in a situation of bipolarity, meaning there's two major centres of competing power. And this, of course, is the Cold War situation dominated by Russia on the one hand and the United States on the other. And it's interesting to speculate, actually, even if Russia hadn't experienced a revolution and the counter-revolution of Stalinism and so on, I think there's an argument you would still have had a face down between Russia and America. Not because Russia was not because of its communism or whatever, but actually because these are two geopolitically opposed powers. And we can see that now. I mean, Russia is obviously no longer, never was since 1928, but there's no sense socialist. It's still pitched up against America in a geopolitical struggle. So there's something here about that kind of struggle between imperial powers. It's got nothing to do with the formal nature of the actual regimes. Okay, but however, the Cold War was pitched in this way. Now, what this meant was a kind of change in the nature of competition between states. As we all know, comrades, the EU has preserved the peace in Europe since 1945, or not. And people may know that I don't have a tremendous high view of the EU, but it is a way in which it actually did mean that competition was restricted to the economic sphere rather than the geopolitical one. That the kind of conflicts that you got ending in full-scale war in 1914 did not occur, and that's partly because of the kind of economic alliance beginning to grow, the NCO community initially, and then also because of NATO. And the two institutions, the EU and NATO, have to be seen as hand in glove and essentially part of the same operation. So you've got, and the same is also true in the East, where similarly you get kind of internal competition clamped down on by the dominance of Russia and so on, and the blocs kind of faced each other. So that's a change from the way this worked out in the first phase of imperialism, except at the edges. I mean, so you get the kind of rubbing up of Turkey and Greece, embarrassing because they're both in NATO, or Iraq and Iran kind of squaring up against each other. So that's the first thing. Cold War simplifies, in a sense, the imperial struggle. The second thing is decolonisation, and here I think we enter the first misunderstanding of the theory of imperialism, because during the period of decolonisation, certainly from 1945 through to about the mid-1970s, what you get is a way in which imperialism is no longer seen as a struggle between imperial capitalist states fighting each other. It becomes instead the imperial state's relationship to the colonial world. Now that was always part of it, but that becomes almost entirely the way it's talked about. As if the struggles, for example, in Vietnam, in the Portuguese Empire, in Africa, and so on. That's what being anti-imperialist is. It's opposing the particular interventions by the imperialist powers and the struggle to liberate themselves by their colonies or former colonies. As decolonisation proceeds, and of course it's interesting, it's the weakest capitalist powers who cling on longest to their colonies. Obviously Portugal, right, one of the weakest states in Europe, is the one that hangs on to the bitter end in Guinea-Bissau and Angola and Mozambique. And it's only in 74, 75 that those countries are finally liberated. Partly as a result of their own struggle, partly because of the revolution in Portugal itself. The struggle in Vietnam wasn't an anti-colonial struggle in that sense. I mean, the colonial period ended in 1954 with the defeat of the French. It was about the power struggle between Russia and America in Indochina, and which side we were going to take. Okay, so that's decolonisation. And finally, the partial industrialisation and the emergence of regional powers. I don't like the term sub-imperialism, partly because I think that it treats imperialism as a quality that's possessed by certain states rather than a system. But certainly regional powers begin to emerge within the structures. So even China, within the Eastern Bloc, develops its own power to a certain extent at odds with that of Russia. To some to a far greater extent within the Western Bloc. And what you get is people oscillating between the two blocs. Egypt is the classic case, finally opting for the West in 1973-74. So within the parameters of the Cold War, you begin to get the emergence of new states with regional power that are not just colonies, or not just kind of semi-colonies of the West. Finally, you get changes after 1973 in the advent of neoliberalism, and particularly after 1989 with the breakdown of the bipolar system. Now, what's often said in international relations discourse is that after this you run a series of unipolarity, it's smoothly moving from multi to bi to unipolar situation. America is the only nation with the power to dominate and to actually considered as a global actor. I think this is, although it's a widely accepted position, I think is a massive exaggeration of what America faces. I think it certainly thought that it was dominant in a unipolar world after 1991, particularly in the First Iraq War as an example of, in a sense, the hubris involved in this. But it didn't last long. I think it was partly based on a kind of misunderstanding of the extent of Russian decline. The assumption that Russia was just collapsing. But in fact, Russia's collapse lasted till the middle of the 90s and then began to actually pull itself together again, particularly militarily, in relation to its oil supplies, and began to assert itself. At this point, or shortly after this, America blunders into the Second World War. Now, there are perfectly rational reasons for why America wanted to go into Iraq. It was going to be a lesson to its allies. Only it could wield the kind of power necessary to bring Saddam to heel. It was also meant as a lesson to people who dared to do things that weren't authorised by America. Only Israel gets to do that. Anybody else, is basically is put into line with the destruction of the entire country, as we know. But it was also about controlling oil supplies, not because America needed the oil, but because it wanted to make sure it controlled who got the oil, particularly China. So there's a kind of geopolitical shift here. It turned out catastrophically for America. And it's true that there's not a single other state, and certainly not China, which can face down America on its own. But actually there's at least 4 or 5 different pressure points facing the USA, one of which is the competition with China. And by the way, it's not simply competition. China owns a large part of America's national debt through the People's Bank. The interconnections between China and America are very close, and not just in terms of competition over territory in the Pacific. China, the catastrophe in the Middle East. Let's be clear, the Americans haven't a clue what they're doing in the Middle East. The idea of some great conspiracy in which America acting as a puppet master, creating Daesh and moving people about here, this is complete nonsense. I mean, there is a sense in which Daesh is a creation of the USA, but in the same way that the Khmer Rouge were. In other words, the social catastrophe of bombing and civil war and so on has created a deranged radical movement, which has come out of that crisis, but it certainly wasn't manipulated by America or anything like this. This is the kind of paranoid fantasies going around, spreading on the West about the all-seeing dominance of America. If America was actually this powerful, would there be any point in fighting it? Because obviously it controls the entire world. It's a complete nonsense, and actually it's a demobilizing factor that people take this seriously. The rise of China is the second major factor here. Now here, it is true that there are transnational corporations which do massively super-exploit workers in China. However, it's also the case there are Chinese firms which massively exploit workers in China, and the Chinese state which exploits people in China. It's a much more complex situation than I think some people on the left concede. I think one explanation would be that the Chinese state deliberately brought in external capitalists initially in order to smooth the transition from state capitalism to neoliberal capitalism, and now is beginning to actually assert itself against them. So there's a kind of, there's a thing going on in China which is difficult to pin down, but one thing we have to be clear about is that any figures about wealth, production, whatever in the third world, or the global south, China distorts them all enormously, because it is the one that is a mass producer of commodities. I mean, there's still production goes on in Bangladesh and bits of India as well, but it's China that's actually the main area where production takes place and so on. Most of the other so-called BRICS and so on are still largely extractive industries where the wealth and trading comes from, not from actual production in the same kind of way. So you have to be very careful looking at statements about the global south, when in fact what you're talking about is basically China in most instances. And by the way, China is also an imperialist power in its own right, not just in terms of military power, but actually in terms of its investment in Africa. After France, it's heading towards being the largest power, and it's on the way up in terms of its position in that continent. We're also seeing, it's the third thing, a return to proxy wars. Now this is a really worrying thing, because actually the run-up to World War I saw many proxy wars, the kind of Japanese-Russian war, in a sense, the Russians acting as a kind of, well, the Japanese acting as a proxy for the Germans in a way, and indeed the Boer War, in which the Boers act as a proxy for the Germans in their struggle with the British. We're seeing this, with people supporting not so much different nations, but groups within nations, in situations of state disintegration. Hezbollah clearly acts as a kind of proxy for Iran, and most of the major players are different groups who are acting in their interests, or partly acting in their interests. Now, the danger is at this point is that you then get sucked into backing up your proxy in a more substantive kind of way, and then generalising that into a wider conflict. That may seem unlikely, and I'm not suggesting that France is going to go to war with Germany next week, anything ridiculous like that, but you have seen different people within the EU actually siding with different groups. When that happened in Yugoslavia, for example, when the breakdown of Yugoslavia was partly initiated by Germany supporting Croatia's separatist move. Okay, so it's proxy wars, and then actual wars being fought out by different powers, often not just by military means. I mean, think about Saudi Arabia's current attempt to flood the oil market and thus reduce the price. This is an attack on Iran, right? And that's affecting everybody, but that's what's actually, this is what this is aimed at. And so there's a struggle going on by military means, but also by non-military means as well. Okay, so there's also, just finally, the newness of the thing, there's also new aspects of the national question. There are obviously still oppressed nationalities, and we obviously, the Kurds, Palestinians, the Tibetans, there are groups who are denied their national status and so on, and there are also still oppressed geographical territories which are contested. But that isn't the main feature of the national question in the 21st century, clearly because there are no colonies in the way there were, but there are very few of them. What you're seeing instead is the emergence, in addition to things I've mentioned, of state disintegration and so-called ethnic struggles within those states that are collapsing, and this is a particular feature of Central Africa, and the emergence of stateless nation nationalism in the First World itself, in Scotland obviously, but in Catalonia and Quebec and several other places. And these are not simply analysable within the context of the right of nations to self-determination, oppressor-oppressed dichotomies and so on. It involves, as I said earlier on, you have to go through an actual political argument about why one supports or does not support these kind of movements, and it has to be about what's in the long-term benefit of the working class within those countries and internationally. Okay, to kind of conclude, one thing we need to understand is that imperialism or imperialist powers come in different sizes. They're not all, and couldn't all be like the United States. Russia and China are imperialist, both in the territorial sense and in the sense of expansion of capital we discussed earlier on. It's particularly true of China. Syria isn't an imperialist power in that sense, but is a regional power. And so these are capitalist states. And I find it extraordinary that people who used to defend Russia and China on the basis that they were deformed or degenerated worker states. I always thought that was, and most people in this room I guess think that's nonsense, but at least there was a kind of logic to that. But the same people are now defending the same states, even though they're no longer even claiming to be social. China, I suppose, does. But you'd have to be very stupid to think that China was socialist in any sense, even in the sense that it normally was under Mao. So we've got this, we're supporting these people because they are, because they're opposed to America, basically. And my enemy's enemy is my friend, we have to support them and so on. This is nonsense. We have to see this as, this is closer to the situation in World War I, where you have a range of different people's powers of different sizes and weights, and we have to oppose them all. I was once told by a leading figure in Stop the War on Facebook that the EU was a bigger threat to the Ukraine than Russia. Now, I don't think the EU, much as I despise it and so on, has actually been responsible for a man-made famine which has killed 10 million Ukrainians, but Russia has, and apart from invading it about 3 times in the last century. So I think, this is madness. I mean, once you get into that kind of stage, you're so fixated on the main enemy being the thing you're associated with, you're simply missing out the history, the geopolitics, then you're losing all sense of being able to rationally analyse what's going on. Opposing your own government doesn't mean supporting their opponents. It was perfectly possible for people to oppose the Falklands War in 1982 without supporting General Galtieri and the Argentinian regime. In fact, it was necessary to call for their overthrow by the Argentinian people at the same time as calling for an end to the war that Britain was waging over the Falklands. We had a discussion this morning about arms, that effectively if people want arms, they have to get them from somewhere. Now, just to respond to the debate that we had, I don't think anyone wants more arms to go into the Middle East. But the point of the argument is that some people have said we cannot, people in Syria or the Kurds have put themselves beyond the pale because they've accepted arms from the Americans or something. People have to fight. If they're fighting, you have to have guns from somewhere. So I think we had this discussion about the Irish in 1916, obviously had their guns from somewhere as well, and that turned out to be Germany. It didn't mean they supported German imperialism. It just meant they were prepared to accept the guns from the imperialist swine. They were prepared to give them to them for their own purposes. So let's not get wound up with that. Finally, and partly to refer to something that Joseph said earlier on, it's not all about geopolitics. There is actually just a simple class struggle that you have to pay attention to. There are 2 aspects of capitalism. One is the competition between capitals, which escalates to the point of war, sometimes between those capitals in their state forms, and we have to oppose that. The other aspect of capital is the exploitation of the working class by all capitals. And now we have both things in mind at all times. We oppose imperialist war, and particularly, of course, in our own country, but at the same time we remember some countries have been torn apart by imperialism. Our support is always with the working class and its allies who are struggling against those regimes. We want Putin to fall and be brought down with the Russian working class. We want Assad to fall and be brought down with the Syrian working class, whether or not that temporarily happens to coincide with what the Americans want at any point. If we're not able to take that position, we'll end up falling into a position of supporting the lesser evil, and I think that's a terrible position for socialists to end themselves in.
Thank you. That was a great speech. So what I'm going to do is try to address some of these issues, but also from the perspective of what it means to be involved in a movement, and what it means to sort of rethink some of these theories and concepts as part of a movement that also provokes new interpretations and challenges some of the ideas. So I think the reason why we're having this debate is because there is obviously a need that has been growing, I think, over the years, specifically, I think, since last year. And I think this has to do with the summer. I think last summer it was an important moment when thousands of refugees reached the borders of Europe, and by the time images of toddlers washing up on shores, something snapped. And despite all the sadness and horror that has to do with that, it also opened up new possibilities for solidarity. We've seen thousands of articles and examples of ordinary people in Europe, black and white, organizing grassroots initiatives to support refugees. But of course, this refugee crisis, as they call it, was directly linked to Syria. So, I mean, although there were refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, migrants from everywhere, I know a couple of Moroccans who said that they were fleeing because of Daesh. Whatever the opportunity is to get to Europe, you do it. But it did show there was something growing that was very inspiring. But what it also exposed, I think, in hindsight, was quite an unresolved issue because of the politics of Syria sort of overwhelming the debate about the refugee crisis. And it was an unresolved issue that was already boiling for a few years, but was kind of spilling over by the time in the summer when, on the one hand, you had Stop the War, organizing demonstrations, in refugee-related demonstrations, and groups like Syria Solidarity Movement. So they were finding each other, basically initiating similar protests or co-organizing them, because it would have been silly to organize different demonstrations, but from different angles. And these different angles, I think, became clearer and clearer, also to the point of where they wouldn't welcome each other at these in certain moments. So inevitably, the tension between solidarity on the one hand and imperialism on the other hand came to the fore. And of course, when plans to bomb Syria were heavily discussed and basically dominating the news in Britain, these tensions really led to a clash. And I think, in hindsight, maybe for good reason, at least the result is that we started having all these important discussions. And of course, it also led to discussions about what is imperialism, and Neil just gave a very good introduction to it. But it seems like there was a very selective understanding of imperialism. I mean, some of us were sort of trained as activists in ABCs of imperialism, and we were told that the algorithmic base of imperialism is both competition and resistance. It wasn't just a nation-state competition, but it also had to do with resistance. And I guess it's also because of the decolonization movements in the 60s that also produced a lot of interesting literature that sort of challenged some of the top-down analysis of imperialism. So, in other words, it taught us that revolutions challenge the logic of imperialism. And that is sort of the great discrepancy in this discussion about Syria, which is an example of a revolutionary moment or movement. But it wasn't part of a debate about redefining imperialism in our age. So what we saw in 2011 is actually all the ingredients were there. The intensity of diplomacy, international relations, class tensions overtaking popular uprisings. All of these elements that are to do with the revolution were imposed on the Arab uprisings. So basically it confirmed how important resistance and self-organization is to the challenge to imperialism. So in my view, this means that there's a new context. I don't know if you can call it a historic moment, but throughout the history there were historic moments where certain theories were being re-discussed, were re-evaluated, like do they still relate to the current conditions? And I think what Neil was trying to do is exactly that, like what remains, what needs to be discussed. But the discourse on imperialism actually stayed the same, because we rely on anti-war intellectuals and movements to provide those modes of rethinking, right? But what is interesting is that the discourse around imperialism and war kind of echoed the same discourse of 2003. So it seemed to a lot of people that the strategies and tactics of groups like Stop the War were kind of unchanged. So the same analysis that were required to critique the invasion of Iraq and the sort of the war on terror after 9/11 were reimposed again on a situation that is quite different. The situation now is one of revolutionary uprising, not of one-sided warfare. So there was also a lot of confusion, I think, in our leftist groups. And this is strange for people, I mean, like myself. I was recruited actually by, ironically enough, one of the leaders of the Stop the War movement when he was on a visit in the Netherlands, by what I thought was fascinating and unique and original, namely the slogan, neither Washington nor Moscow. And I thought, wow, actually there's an alternative, there's a third way of looking at things. And you're still an anti-imperialist. And it's really strange because at the same time some of our groups did not apply this sort of meta slogan on the issue of Syria. So for instance, in my own group, there were people who would say you have to choose between Daesh or Cameron. You can't be anti-Cameron and also critique Daesh. You need to not say something about Daesh because it will strengthen Cameron's speech about the bombings of Daesh. So this completely doesn't relate to the idea of neither Washington no Moscow. So lots of confusing discussions. So also, as you mentioned and in the session before, we also were reminded constantly that the main enemy is at home. But what I want to also share here is that for many of us in the movement, we don't have one enemy. We don't have one home. That's a difference maybe also with 100 years ago. Maybe there's more internationalization, more globalization, more migration. This is a different demography that we are dealing with. So it also probably requires some rethinking on that level. And I think these are all important issues and critiques in the spirit of comradeship, but I think it sort of tells me, at least, that Syria, more than any other example in the Middle East now, has become sort of the revolution writ small. It raises all these questions in a very tense and fast tempo that maybe are also present in other contexts, but Syria is the context actually where the difference between solidarity and imperialism, and also between what it means to be in a movement that has one enemy at home. So what happened to this movement? It seems that the mainstream anti-war movement simply wasn't able to adapt its strategy and tactics to these seismic shifts of 2011, and this resulted in two things. On the one hand, it maybe unintendedly, but in some ways intendedly, it helped erase the agency of the people there, especially when we talk about Syria. They're kind of invisible now. There was a 5th anniversary this weekend, but I think it's problematic when we look at the visual examples and we don't see flags of leftist groups or union banners, or so their agency of the people are practically erased. And the second is that it fails to acknowledge the role of other imperialist powers. And I think this is something that also Neil addressed, but I will mention again later. And a lot of us wondered why. They're not bad intended groups or people. What is it? We need to answer also why, so that we can prevent this to happen again. Is it Stalinism? A lot of people say, yeah, it's Stalinist tendencies in the anti-war movement. It sounds a bit too easy. Is it just narcissism? Some people just always want to be right and don't want to change their position. Is it perhaps opportunism that is sometimes typical to the United Fronts, that you don't want to antagonize your coalition? I gave up wondering, but I think this is an important reason. Why is this possible to happen? And so, I mean, it also is confusing for a lot of people who have a reflex regarding Syria, but also by any means don't want to be considered assisting imperialist agenda. So yes, not uniting with our ruling class when the drums of war are louder is very important for many of us. But we just wonder why fighting against our own government why does it remove the duty of solidarity to others? And I'm glad that some people gave examples of how this actually never was the case. Also in the times that slogans like the main enemy is at home came up, actually it never was only the main enemy is at home, but I heard, Nick is not here, but he told me a very interesting story about the friendship between Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and how he supported her in her issues around Poland, and there was never this contradiction. So I think we need to correct this. We need to bring back some of the values that are not as one-sided as they are, and at the same time rethink some of those values. And I think we need to do this because, for one thing, this dilemma or problem is alienating a lot of people from leftist politics. I mean, that's what I see in my environment, and specifically among Arab activists, who also then sort of refer to leftist activist groups and anti-war activism as one thing. And so they then make the connection that, oh, this is because typical Marxism is a white theory, and they don't really care about other people's struggle. So I think we need to regain some of our politics to also win some of the people towards the left, because I mean we could say Lenin also was one of the people who wrote extensively about the revolution and our parties being the tribune of the oppressed, and that the tribune of the oppressed means that you first and foremost side with those who are resisting their oppression, no matter where, no matter how. So, and this is, I think, where the third effect of the anti-war weakness comes up. I think the third effect is that it was really not attuned to the dominant sentiment in Syria and here of mass solidarity and mass resistance from below. And this is really interesting about the summer. It showed, it surprised, I think, some very experienced long-term activists, this moment of explosion of solidarity and initiative. For me, it meant they were not actually in tune because they're not part of those movements, they're not part of those communities anymore. And they are also not attuned to the sort of ordinary sentiment of people who are basically saying we are not with Assad, but we're also not with ISIS. And we know that there needs to be a solution for refugees. So in a way, it seems like working class people have this double critique that sort of precedes the anti-war intellectual level of having this double critique. And there's this tendency to deflect critique by pointing at past triumphs. And first time it works, the second time it works, and then it stops working. This example of the 2 million people marching in the streets of London, and all these past triumphs that are coming up. And of course we enjoyed watching George Galloway on TV in the US Congress making a fool out of them in 2005. But we certainly don't enjoy watching George Galloway now on pro-Assad television, such as El Mayadeen, where he actually basically espouses a lot of pro-Assad gibberish. And we also have a problem with Patrick Cockburn, who writes in the London, I think, what is it, London Review of Books, book review, basically about Syria in a very Sunni-Shia dichotomy. And that basically that Daesh is the greatest threat to the Syrian people. What he basically does for a lot of us is he brings back memory of Blairite analysis and intellectuals. So I think past achievement of the anti-war movement should also therefore not be credited to extraordinary achievements of certain individuals. And this brings up another important issue. It's not certain individuals in groups like Stop the War that are very important to take example from. It's the thousands of ordinary people across the country who were furious about British lies and a devastating war that have put their heads and hearts into building and sustaining a movement. So it's important to not throw the baby with the bathwater, and I agree that Stop the War is an important part of our history, and perhaps in some places they still are relevant, and we need to talk about where they are and where they aren't, or how. I know not everybody agrees, but we also need to ask them why the current anti-war movement has been unable to match its previous mass base. Why does the current anti-war movement not have the same demographic representation? Why aren't there less Arabs or Muslims involved? There's a correlation between its position on Syria and the way that the movement looks like. And I think it's particularly disillusionment with part of the left that drove away people at certain crucial moments like the sarin gas attacks. I mean, they were not just avoiding engagement, they were actually reproducing a certain narrative that it was not Assad and that it was, I don't know, conspiracies as Neil said. So that brings me to my second main point. Who defines the movement? Who defines the parameters of our movement? I think it's very difficult to say this because you're easily interpreted as being a sort of falling in the trap of identity politics when you bring forward the question of difference, and different types of people bringing different types of demands and context to a movement. But I think it's an important question, and I think also we have a lot to learn from feminist history when women got up and also demanded certain redefinitions or shaping. I think that we are now at the moment, in the most important sort of crisis moment of our age, which the Arab uprisings together with the economic crisis have brought up, where we have a certain population that brings this confusing thing of having multiple enemies and multiple homes. So what does this mean? I think, again, at the risk of being boxed as identity politics, I think revolutionary slogans like the main enemy at home should be maybe avoided, because I think they really counter contemporary public and political subjectivities, as they say. Because what is the concrete question for someone who has been in Syria and is now here as a refugee? We say that we support refugees coming here and that they should be on equal terms like us. But they will then also bring their demands into the movement about how we deal with the issue of Syria. And as I said, I know Syrian organizers who were, until last year in Syria, played an incredibly important role from which we can learn so much. I mean, there's so much to learn from Syrian activists, and who don't want to be involved with leftist groups here because they see our debates and they think that's not my priority. So how do we get them back? I think Leila is sitting here. She and Robin wrote an amazing book about how the revolution still continues and how much we can learn from them. But I think also Raya in the last session mentioned something very important. Syrian friends who are here now and who are potentially important allies, but also teachers or comrades, but who are absent. But yet, at the same time, they organize their own activities. There's a parallel world going on now, where you have all these Syrian and other activists organizing their own things that is completely sort of secluded from the left. I think there's a problem that we need to talk about. So, I mean, what it also means is that in terms of who these people are and when they have a voice, it seems to me that it seems to me that some of our voices are deemed more or less valuable vis-a-vis the oppressor we are a product of. So basically, I mean, it's quite sad that we are living in a voice where you're in a world where your voice is useful, depending on the political alliances of your dictator. So this means that the leverage from those linked to Saudi Arabia or Egypt is by default lucrative compared to someone from Syria and Iran. And we've seen this slightly in the the Green Revolution in 2009, where the left also had a problem with giving Iranians a platform. So I think that a lot of people are saying we reject the notion that our value in activist circles should be based on the locality of our oppressor. We reject this identity of your value being related to the geopolitical compass that you bring about. And I think this is a very important problem that also a lot of radical Palestinian leftists bring to the fore. You should definitely read some of Budur Hassan's writings, who are saying don't use us as a shield against the Syrians. So finally, I think the issue of self-determination is a very important one, and I think probably we should shift maybe there's some risks in it, but maybe we need to reverse our focus and instead of focusing on geopolitics, now bend the stick the other way and refocus on self-emancipation of the oppressed. Because I think geopolitics as an analysis is widely available, there's a lot of writings and contributions, but self-emancipation, self-determination is quite absent. And I think we should bring that back. And then I think that could be a test for the progressive elements of anti-imperialism. For me, that would test whether it's an anti-imperialism of the left or an anti-imperialism of the right. And this is a concrete question. Can we still talk about anti-imperialism as by default a leftist position? I think a lot of us have now come to the point like, no, anti-imperialism, it's just representing a certain theoretical approach to competition and states and warfare, but it's not by default left. Not anymore, at least after 2011. So that's another concrete question. Should we redefine what anti-imperialism is? Right-wing elements in the movements can also be anti-imperialist, and they are not necessarily our allies. So, I mean, I'm asking this because when this discussion comes up, there's a kind of sort of idea like you always have to work with anti-war groups. They are our natural allies, and I'd like to raise this question. Why is that so? Convince me. Maybe there are right-wing elements within it. Maybe not. Maybe we have to, because they build their analysis on the argument of the main enemy is at home. So even if you don't like them, even if you don't like their rejection of engaging with Syrian revolutionaries, they still do something else that is very important. And I think we need to ask another question. It's one thing to oppose your own enemy, but it's something else to only oppose the enemy of your enemy in a selective way. I think that was the main problem with a lot of Syrians in the movement. The main problem was not so much, yeah, but they're only focusing on Britain. The main problem was also, they're focusing on Britain, but they're only focusing also in the rest of their narrative on the United States as an important ally of Britain, whereas they don't focus and write about Russia or Iran as a major counter-revolutionary element. So it's this selective, indirect stretching of what anti-imperialism means that also has led to a lot of tensions. So finally, I think we need to probably say something that is very simple, and that is internationalism and solidarity are not just labels. They're not just labels or titles for our pamphlets or flyers. Solidarity with this, solidarity with that. They are issues and principles that demand action. They demand action, especially after 5 years of Arab uprisings, otherwise they are just empty words. And I think this is not something impossible. As I said, our movement intersects in all kinds of ways, and we have all kinds of different ethnicities and people who are from the region that could be an organic part of the movement with which you can build concrete solidarity and internationalism. So I think that our duty is to say now that we've had a lot of time to think, and that we've had a few years of passivity, how can we now turn this into demands and concrete action? I think this is very important, because I think otherwise we risk, or it's already happening, as I said, turning some of the very important progressive elements of anti-imperialism, throwing them away by allowing people to make a link between anti-imperialism and no support for Syria. For me, as a leftist progressive Arab, this is very problematic. It means I have to have two different fights or debates. And I think this is very important to be part of the movement, because there are sometimes problems with a lack of engagement that result in, for instance, there was one demonstration where there were posters, Stop the War, that whose main flyer actually prominently displayed the regime flag. And I think that this was a slip. This wasn't on purpose, but it was, I think it wasn't on purpose. I think it was a slip because it's such a symbolic slip. It's a slip because there's no engagement. There's no one actually telling them, look, this is pro-Assad, this is anti-Assad, so you should choose this and not that. It's a complete result of not being involved. I think also we need to take some accountability. Without guilt-tripping or moralism, I think we need to just say that politics can be sometimes very simple. The absence of a leftist factor renders something less leftist. That's very simple. So if Syria solidarity groups, the moment they had leftists involved, there were discussions in which they managed to shape the debate, which then led to not agreeing with a military intervention. At other moments when leftists were absent, and we know this literally because we were in these meetings here at SOAS, decision making about the no-fly zone or about military intervention were not based on the arguments of leftists, but were based often on feelings of horror because of another barrel bombing destroying their families' houses. It's very simple. You don't have to be Einstein to understand that it's not a pro-imperial sentiment that led to the decision-making about a no-fly zone, but about our own absence in that movement. So in conclusion, we don't need a left that has done very little to engage with progressive forces and then later turn around and then reject engaging because some of them are asking for a no-fly zone. And so we should also be careful and contextualize certain issues. We should at some point stop pointing fingers to groups because of a letter in The Guardian, because it's not like we never made any strategic mistakes. I mean, it's one element in a long process. And I think we should look at our own absence or presence in when these mistakes are taken. So what we want to see is an anti-war movement that stands in solidarity with the revolutions. The question is, what anti-war movement? Are we able to reform the present anti-war movement? Do we have to get rid of them and build their own? Do we have to all engage with the current one in order to try to shift them? That's the main question. But whatever the alternative is, it does provide and demand practical solidarity to Syrian revolutionaries. Of course, it sounds impossible, and Joseph was right. All these people who are so sort of wise to keep telling us that the revolution is over. Oh, you don't understand because, you know, it's already over because this or that element is not present anymore. It's a total civil war. And so people think that it's impossible to think about Syria outside the prism of Assad or Daesh at the moment. Of course, it all sounds impossible, but sometimes it's good to remember 2010 when ordinary people achieved extraordinary things. Who thought that Mubarak and Ben Ali would fall in 2010? We would be declared crazy, even crazier than we are declared now. So in the meantime, we explicitly reject Daesh, as they are counter-revolutionary in our view, even if they are also hated by other counter-revolutionaries and our own enemy at home. So this is also a concrete question that I think we've dealt with in this organization. Like, is Daesh part of imperialist counter-revolution or anti-imperialist elements? I think this is a concrete moment to say they are counter-revolutionary, and there's no contradiction with regarding our state as counter-revolutionary as well. And also, we will stop our enemy at home, because we know that in the end, it's not really Daesh or Assad that they want to bomb. It's, of course, our comrades that they want to bomb as well. Yeah, so one of the most who've been engaged with Syria solidarity activism as well is what they taught us about the human strength and possibilities. We learned about the amazing work of ordinary Syrians, about patience, about incredible conviction, and about their fantastic humor. They have the best banners in the Arab world, I think. I can say that, although I think the Moroccans are slightly better. They have the best songs, they have the best joke. We have so much to learn and to laugh with them. Even if none of them are worthy a quote or a citation in a Robert Fisk text or a Patrick Cockburn piece, because forgetting is easy, forgetting them is easy. People are now talking about 2011 as if it's the past. They're talking about 2011 as the history. And I think this is really problematic. And we need to remember the main slogan of the Arab uprisings. This was Hurriya, Karama, Adala Ijtimaiya, which means freedom, dignity, and social justice. And dignity is not only something moral. Dignity is also the respect to be heard. Samar Yazbek wrote about the young men and women of the revolution who were willfully ignored, and that they were blamed for provoking a civil war. And this is the most undignified feeling that a revolutionary can have. So asking, what do they say about intervention before lending support, or answering with ancient quotes can't be the starting point. The starting point should be, how can we be part of your movement? How can we contribute to turning the tide? How can we participate in what is also our struggle?
I would like to come up and be filmed for then you can go off to that.
Yeah, I want to thank Neil and Miriyam both for very interesting talks, and I think Neil particularly, I think a couple of things he hit on helped us to understand how the left got it so wrong over Syria. I think the fact that this sort of seeing anti-imperialism as only being this anti-colonial struggle and not like a critique of it, seeing imperialism as a system fed into that. And I think, for the Stop the War movement, I think is a mix of very bad politics, also some possible personal corruption and an unwillingness to break with alliances that people had built, back in the Stop the War movement 2003 and had kept going for, over a decade. These things were not easy to come apart, and people felt it easier to just try and replay 2003 rather than adjust to the new reality. And I do think there was a new reality. We had the global economic crisis in 2007, 2008. We had a change of leadership in the US. I think the US Army was badly damaged by the occupation of Iraq and was in no shape to go invading and occupying any other countries. So this idea that kind of 2000, that there's a real threat of a ground invasion or anything but due to the Arab uprising of the US intervening, that was never really on the cards. And actually, really, if you actually analyse the situation, Joseph, I didn't say it here, but he spoke about it in the MENA Solidarity meeting yesterday. If you analyse what the imperialists were doing over Syria, they never wanted the regime to fall. They made conscious decisions which allowed it to go on smashing up the popular movement. There was no-fly zone, despite that being a demand from this peaceful revolution from quite early on, once they started shelling and dropping barrel bombs. There was no heavy weaponry to the Free Syrian Army. And the sort of, I think you have to see what the regional powers did. Turkey and Saudi and Qatar is they faced pressure from their own populations who had a lot of sympathy with the Syrian revolt. The Saudi working class population, the Turkish, Islamic, supporters of the AKP, they had a lot of sympathy with the revolt. And some of the support for that was why they intervened, but also they had to deal with the repercussions. Turkey took 2.5 million refugees from Syria. It has a material interest in trying to resolve the conflict, but even then it didn't use its power as much as it could. Again, like Joseph said, because they were really as afraid of a victory for the Syrian revolution as they were of the bad effects of it kind of continuing and the destruction going on. But the imperialist powers never wanted it gone. They wanted stability. They wanted to go back to pre the crisis, pre the Arab revolts and stuff. But they weren't able to. You had a successful counter-revolution to a degree in Egypt, but they hadn't succeeded in Syria. And that's because the depth of the revolutionary movement there has been so strong, and that's what they were so afraid of. That's why they said no-fly zone. Because they knew. Imagine if there'd been no-fly zone. I think they could have got rid of Assad 2012, 2013, and all these lives that have been wasted since then would have gone into building a really strong democratic, the self-organisation that's kept the movement going. All of that could have actually been put into building a new society. It would have been amazing, and that's what they were so afraid of, because it would have torn apart the balance of power around the Middle East, like Israel and the situation of the Palestinians as well. 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria, who in a new democratic Syria would have been able to use it as a big organising base to challenge Israel. All these things were why the imperialists didn't want Assad to go. And that's the thing, the reason there was this rhetoric of supporting is, because they're democratic powers, they have to be seen to support popular uprisings. But they did everything they could not to. And I think that was the part of it, not seeing that was sort of like really wrong-footed the left. And I do think there has to be an apology and an admission that things were wrong in order to, repair ties with all the Arab democratic activists, and so people can learn the lessons. I think that the left has to say, look, we got it wrong on this, and to a degree, criticise the institutions and really chuck out all the counter-revolutionary fucks who have been slandering the Syrian revolution for so long. Really, I'm sorry, these people don't belong on Stop the War platforms and stuff. If you're not going to support popular uprisings and slander them, we have to do a house clearing of our side. These people can't be allowed to still kind of parade as progressives when they've been backing a vicious counter-revolution, which has caused untold human suffering. So I think that's kind of vital part of understanding the situation we're in today and how we can go about rebuilding it and rebuilding a left in it's connected to these democratic movements which are still fighting and struggling in the
the thing about that Miriyam said about the sort of a reluctance to engage with the left on the part of Arab activists. One of the problems, I think, I was on the Syria Solidarity demonstration yesterday, as indeed a number of people were, but both from RS21 and others were. But the thing was, actually, as organisations, we were invisible. I mean, they could tell that there were white people there and whatever, but we were there sort of seen as individuals. So, I mean, one very, very simple thing that we can do is actually make sure we have banners on the demonstrations supporting them, and that we are visible. Not a major theoretical point, but nonetheless, I think it's a simple one that we could probably quite simply solve. I mean, what this then happened, so you then get, of course, all the things, I mean, continuously seeing posts on Facebook about attacking the revolutionary left as a whole, you know, distinguished, you know, not involved. It's rather annoying to sort of get back from having spent, it was a very, very long demonstration. We actually walked for 2 hours. After assembling for an hour, we then walked for 2 hours, and then there was a thing. So coming all the way from Oxford, did that, went out again, logged on to Facebook to discover that there were attacks on the revolutionary left for not turning up to it. It was very, very, very annoying. You get, and also, I mean, you get silly things like there was a Syria solidarity demonstration in Manchester. I forget who organised it. Manchester Stop the War turned up with their banner, and then there were complaints that they shouldn't have been allowed on, not because of anything that they'd done, but because of sort of things that Stop the War people in London had done, i.e. backed Assad, which, I mean, actually, you know, I lived in Manchester 15 years. Blame Mancunians for something that people in London have done, and you're on a very, very dangerous territory indeed, mate. So, you know, it is very, very silly. I emphasise this now because you do get, then, members of RS21 clicking like on the Facebook things. And I think this is a terribly bad thing to do. You're actually effectively encouraging red baiting and a split. We come from a tradition where the revolutionary left, I mean, once upon a time, the revolutionary left was dominated by people who saw the world in bipolar terms. There is this communist society in Russia and in the Eastern Bloc, and a capitalist society in the West. And, you know, if you're a revolutionary, you should be backing the Soviet Union. And we were a very small minority, and we said no, like the Washington on Moscow and so forth. And you said, I mean, not just her, I mean, a lot of people saw that. I saw that as well. You know, and think, yes, there is an alternative, there is something that... And it did attract people, and it did organise. And against all the odds, it was a tradition that grew. And yes, okay, there are a lot of people, as Miriyam said, a lot of this is due to ignorance and people and things not being sort of put in front of people. That's the fact. And, you know, we can't, you know, at the moment, you know, that demonstration, it was actually largely Syrians and a few supporters. We can turn this situation around, but to do that, we really have to take that as a sort of project that we have to do, and we can do.
I think in some ways what we're starting to do is have a debate about what's happened in the anti-war movement since 2000, which we didn't really have at the time. I think that there was a lack of clarity. I think that one reason for that was that the revolutionary left, in the sort of concrete situation largely the SWP, was called on, as Johnny was saying, to do two contradictory things. To hold together a movement, which included Christians, pacifists, Stalinists, all kinds of forces, to hold together that movement, but also to act as a revolutionary force within it. And unsurprisingly, it turned out to be something that was impossible to do. So there was always a lack of clarity, a lack of openness, a lack of debate, you know, about, for example, the fact that the huge demo in 2003, which you could have hoped would stop the war, actually didn't, and why was that, and what lessons can we learn from it, and so forth. So there are all of the criticisms to be made of that, but I think that just on the ground, in practice, I do want to echo what, for example, what John was saying about stop the war on the ground in different cities is a different thing from the Stop the War leadership and the various compromises and betrayals that they're guilty of so as to keep the show on the road and to maintain their own position, which is that, for example, in Hackney, Hackney Stop the War organised a meeting at the time of Israel attacking Gaza in the summer of 2014, got 160 people along. The 400 people who remain on the Hackney Stop the War mailing list are some of the people in Hackney who you would want to involve in any campaign. And it seems to me that we have to, difficult and sometimes unpleasant though it is, have to try to continue to work with them and try to win them to better positions, because simply discounting them and walking them away and walking away from them is to reject the only force on the ground that is actually there, when we don't have, as far as I can see, any way of actually producing some kind of alternative out of a hat. That was true in Cambridge before Christmas, when the march around the town against the bombing of Syria was called by Cambridge Stop the War. This doesn't mean that there are, there are all of the inadequacies that we've talked about, but it seems to me that we also can't just dismiss an organisation which exists, which is part of the left, which organises in many cases the best people. We have to try and raise, we have to try and raise political arguments.
So first, thank you for the two speakers for a great intervention. It was really interesting. I would like to maybe to bring it, to enter the debate around a few things. First of all, about the meaning of imperialism, as you well explained in the beginning. I think one of the mistakes has been to call any kind of political movement or state opposing the United States as anti-imperialist. This is nothing to do with the definition. Imperialism, as I understand, and we always start from, for me, below, analysis from below, the capitalist dynamics, socio-economic dynamics, and because of the book of Lenin is very good in his title, the ending state of, I don't know the English title, but the State Supreme du Capitalisme. And this is how we understand it. Actually, you don't start from the end to come back to the beginning. You start from the beginning to understand the capitalist dynamics, to understand the various imperialist dynamics. And when it comes to various political movements, this has been an enormous mistake. And today we've seen this with Daesh, some people calling it anti-imperialist because it would oppose the US. It has nothing to do with anti-imperialism. Just as Hezbollah had nothing to do in 2006 or before with anti-imperialism. Yes, we support all forms of resistance against Israel when it attacks Palestine or Lebanon or any other country, or if the US attack Iran, but it doesn't mean that you transform this political movement or state into a progressive actor. And this has been one of the mistakes, I'm sorry to say, of sections of the left. Transform this kind of political forces into anti-imperialist or so-called progressive. They have nothing, they are capitalist political movements, reactionary on many levels, etc. I don't need, so this is one of the problems also when we speak of anti-imperialism. And obviously, various countries and regions of the world have various understanding of imperialism because of their direct region. For example, South America will mostly be concerned with US imperialism, rightly, and in their perspective. And in Ukraine, as you said, if you're going to speak of to the people about the European Union threat, they're going to laugh at you, just like in Syria. When you ask people, but why don't you condemn more concretely today, now, US imperialism? Say, but today we're being bombed by Russian bombing, and I tell you, it hurts as much as US bombing. So this is also something you have to understand and oppose all kind of imperialism in this perspective, and also understand this imperialism into capitalist dynamics. For me, this is fundamental. And as Marx said, when the revolutionary movement started in 2011, we were in a completely different setup. US had been defeated in Iraq. It was also being, it is still the most important imperialist power in the world, but its power is, relatively speaking, diminishing. And it was focusing more on East Asia, etc., because of China's threat. And since the beginning of the revolutionary processes in the Middle East, US position has been we want to maintain states as as they are, and limited change as the maximum. So maintaining old regime with including the Muslim Brotherhood generally. And this is why, by the way, the Peace Nobel process has been given, the Peace Nobel has been given to Tunis. It's the perfect example for imperialism. It maintains the imperialist systems completely, fantastically, because Muslim Brotherhood and the old authoritarian, old regime don't want to challenge neoliberal policies, don't want to challenge imperialist system, neither Israel, etc., and want to break democratic and social forces on the ground. This is key. This does not mean when the Muslim Brotherhood are being repressed, you don't defend them. You defend all kind of people that are being attacked, repressed, etc. This is another discussion. But listen, and this was the plan for Syria since day one, to include various sections of the bourgeois, especially Muslim Brotherhood, forces into a single regime. This was called the Yemeni type solution. I have a small disagreements concerning Saudi Arabia, Qatar, especially they're the centers of the counter-revolution. You cannot separate their actions and practices from Syria to other countries. And if the best thing that can happen for the Syrian revolution is revolutions in the Gulf monarchies. From Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, must be very clear. This would be the best thing for Syrian revolutionaries. Yes, indeed, Saudi Arabia and Qatar might have supported rhetorically the revolution, but they brought their sectarian discourse, saying, for example, the Sunni blood is one in their canals, supporting Islamic fundamentalist forces, although also supporting FSA forces, but also mostly Islamic fundamentalist forces, etc. Now, for me, this is very key not to consider them anymore as friends, because as they're being repressed, protesters in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or Bahrain, these are our brothers and comrades, not the Saudi or Qatari. And I know you didn't mean this at all, Mark. But for me, this is very important, even among Syrian opposition. For Turkey, it was the Kurdish issue is being problematic among the Syrian. I support the self-determination of the Kurdish people completely. And for me, treating Erdogan is no friend to the Syrian people. He has been also supporting various sections of the revolution in Syria that are conservative or reactionary in many aspects for its own political interest and increasingly against the Kurds. On Stop the War, I've been listening a lot of a lot of youth and young people are still in the movement. And I'm not in London, I'm not in England, and it's true maybe sometimes focusing on the leadership of London Stop the War. And if there's a work that is done among the youth that is entering Stop the War, that are not still politicized, that don't know about the various political dynamics, and if they are political groups, revolutionary activists, but not on an individual basis, but on an organized way that challenge the leadership on a basic united front, okay, let's challenge this. But if it's not done, you have to learn also from other, and it will be my last word, I'm sorry, the Lebanese experience of 2003, saying clearly in Lebanon 2003 during the Stop the War demonstration in Lebanon, there was two demos. One, only no to foreign intervention, that brought around 2,000 people. A second one that brought much more people, saying no to foreign intervention, but no to dictatorships also in the region, and support to the people in struggle. And this brought a lot more people. And this should be
comments that we are learning from, and I think it speaks for this organization to organize this. I mean, we are complaining in a way, but that's because we are among comrades, and so we can say also what we want to say without risking the usual sort of self-censorship, at least for myself, is that a lot of this is demoralizing, and you don't say this in public, or you don't say this too much because you also don't want to demoralize or demobilize. But I think it's good to have this internal debate because it shows that there are groups on the left that are actually rethinking and are open to re-engaging. And so I think the question of how to do that is very important. And so the last question of Raya is always good. And I think the session after this hopefully will deal with some of that. So what are the concrete campaigns that we can get involved with? I think that most importantly is how can we re-engage? There were really interesting connections in the first year of the uprisings. And it's also a question of like, is that just gone forever, or can we re-engage? Are there still like friendships and bonds that we can, you know, I mean, it's okay, like we're forgiving human beings. We can say like, you know, we've had a shitty time on the left. I mean, we've had some issues in terms of crisis and splits. So, you know, we should have a kind of automatic reply in our life, like an email, sorry, due to circumstances to do with internal splits, cannot deal with the other issues at the moment. And then it's okay to like remove that and say, you know, how, okay, what did I miss, how can we re-engage? I think also strategically we might have to think about what we consider political and what we consider not political. I mean, there's a contradiction, and I fall, I am Bullock, what's the term? I'm responsible partly for that as well, because I also say there's a problem with how political activism descended or moved into a purely humanitarian relief. And I think it's a manifestation of the weakness of the left. But I also think we need to be careful with that. I think we also need to understand that in the context of relief that is a result of political crisis, that is itself the result of revolutionary uprisings, relief has a much more political connotation than relief from, I mean, without ignoring the importance, but relief from, for instance, natural disasters. This kind of relief, there's something essentially political about it. So we also need to rethink about what we see as a division of labor among groups and political actors. It's not like we think, okay, let those do the relief and we'll do the activism. A lot of issues related to relief at the moment to do with refugees and migrants are quite political. They're about anti-racism, but they're also about, you know, concretely, as you said, you know, the people who come, who are refugees, some of them were leaders on the ground there. They can do like political activism. So we need to rethink also what we mean by relief. And I think if we agree that relief is also political activism, then suddenly there's a whole different perspective. Then there's all these opportunities out there that, as you said, is a parallel world almost. And I won't also just say it's our loss, not their loss. Sometimes I'm like cynical as well. It's our loss. It's not their loss. We're still bickering, but it's also their loss because it has concrete ramifications for the kind of decisions that are being made about timing, about, you know, when do you, how do you frame something. I think what we also need to do is be a bit gentle in terms of about forgiving errors. And I mean, I was having this debate in another context about white privilege, where white people are evil and are wrong and everything, and I was also trying to say, like, come on, this is not even what our black radical history is saying. And of all people, Malcolm X was one of the people who said, you know, we have to be careful and don't dismiss and don't easily condemn people for not having reached the same political point of analysis as you have. When you started activism in your early days, you also didn't have all the answers and knew everything. So I think we also need to deal in a way like that with people who are just entering Stop the War and understanding maybe they have no idea what they're entering, but their gut feeling is saying, I don't like war. I agree that we shouldn't be too focused on Stop the War, but I think there's a problem, Johnny, and that is that they do eclipse a lot of they have a dominant position in shaping the debate. We can't compete with them. We can't say, well, you know, they're not, you know, the only actor. The thing is, the literature, the activist literature, a lot of the stuff that we digest, that informs our knowledge about imperialism, anti-imperialism, and war comes from anti-war groups. So there is something about the fixation comes from an interest in trying to break that dominance. And I think it's also related to the fact that they have been avoided by other groups. The confrontation has been avoided. I don't know what that is. I mean, I don't want to fall into party politics, whatever. But I still don't understand, like, I think, for instance, a big group, that is still a big group, fuck, I forgot the name. Socialist Workers' Party, sorry. Oh my God, that was really not... I think there's some avoidance there. They also avoid confronting Stop the War. There's something about, it's not just Stop the War, it's also how others are avoiding, and then avoiding reshaping what we mean by revolution, not revolution. There's something about the politics avoidance of the left here that I think needs to be tackled as well. And I think one of the things you can do by breaking that is by being the one who does speak out. And I think that RS21 has been quite good about it, publishing articles on the website about Syria, Syrian activists, interviews with activists and movements and campaigns and things that Mark wrote about. Maybe last point, I think it's very important what Sophie raised. We are not just here to chit-chat and to... This also is a result of the conference, national conference. And I think it is also very important to say we put our money where our mouth is. If we come to the conclusion that some of the discussions and decisions that were made a few months ago were based on a lack of knowledge or based to selective knowledge, then also the motions that were proposed there are not valid anymore. I really think that we should retreat that motion at that time that had this condition that we should only support, we will support Syrian activists, we will help promote Syrian activists to speak on Stop the War platforms if they are anti-Assad and anti-imperialist, whatever.
Against the no-fly zone.
Against the no-fly, something like that. This conditionality of... Sorry?
Didn't mention the no-fly zone.
No, it was about the kind of Syrians you support, speaking, correct me if I'm wrong. What was it again?
I think it said anti-Assad and anti-intervention.
Yes, anti-Assad and anti-intervention.
Yeah.
That, I think we should really remove that. We are not in a position to say to Syrians, we support you if you have this, this and this before you go on a platform. And the other way around as well. You can also not support those who are saying, I'm only going to speak when it's for intervention. You just cannot simply put conditions, because these conditions, the positions that people have change. What I say today as a Syrian about no-fly zone, that could be informed by the barrel bomb, could have changed next month if I interact with Neil, who tells me something about imperialism and the threat of intervention. These positions and opinions change. You cannot put these conditions. My complete suggestion here is to say this motion hereby we cancel that, or at least we don't mention that ever in the outside world.
My view is we should be part of Stop the War while it's going as an operation. I think it'd be stupid to back out of it or to set up something counter to it or anything like that. I think the point of it there being different Stop the Wars in different cities is well taken. Scottish Stop the War is quite different from the London Stop the War, and our comrades are heavily involved in it and certainly help run the Edinburgh branch of it. So I think that's just, you know, we need to take it seriously and have a discussion within Stop the War about the kind of politics that it got so badly wrong. I also think it's perfectly okay to have this openly and in public. I don't think it should be blackmailed into saying we can't criticise him because Jeremy Corbyn's being critiqued by the right. Fine. If we let people say stupid things on the left and don't criticise them, it'll assume we agree with those things. We have to say it while still maintaining part of the relationship with the organisation. Secondly, it's about, people have said that Syria, some sections of the left supported the revolution initially and then backed away from it very quickly in 2012. Well, at least people supported the Syrian revolution to start with. In the Ukraine, it was being denounced as a CIA and in one case FBI-backed revolutionary movement from the moment people gathered in Maidan. This is insane. Revolutions are always going to involve complex forces, including quite right-wing forces in this case, but it was a genuine revolution, unlike the colour revolution of 8-9 years earlier. And I mean, whatever's happened since then we can discuss, but the idea that a revolution against Russia and its actual imperialist domination of the Ukraine is somehow not a revolution seems to me to be completely abandoning any sense of what imperialism actually is. Two final points. One is on, Duncan mentioned I'd raised the question of degenerated worker states and state capitalism. I wasn't actually criticising the generic worker state's position. I was simply saying it isn't even consistent with that. I mean, I don't agree with it, but it's a perfectly logical and coherent position. I just think that people now still accept defending Russia, when it clearly isn't even what they would have called that, just doesn't make any sense. However, since you did mention the contrast between state capitalism and the generic worker state, I will say this. One thing that I think state capitalism has got very much going for it is it's radically opposed to all forms of substitutionism. And what people, I think, are doing in their adoration of Putin and Assad is looking for a substitute for the actual working class with some kind of so-called left-wing or progressive dictator. That, I think, is what I think it strongly still acts as a barrier against. And in that sense, we should, even though it's becoming more of a historical kind of concept, it's also something that's important to maintain. Finally, just two things about what we do. There's two clear things that we have to do. One is to defend refugees and open borders for refugees in the EU and out of the EU, whatever the actual structure is, and have them come in here. The second is to support the actual revolutionary movements in Syria and other countries in the Middle East against their regimes, whatever imperialism is doing. But there has to be a bridge between those things, between the refugees who are in this country and the position we take in the Middle East or any other bit of the world where there's a revolution going on. And that, to me, is like, this is one of the greatest movements of people from one bit of the world to another that's ever happened, and more so perhaps at the end of World War II, maybe even more so than in the 1860s and 70s. That changes the entire dynamic of world politics. It means there are people in this country and other European countries, some of them are revolutionaries, some of them reformists, who come from the Middle East, who are going to be here, we hope, for some time. We have to relate to them, involve them in our organisation, treat them like intelligent, normal, revolutionary human beings who we can speak to and have a discussion with and work alongside, trying to convince them of our politics. This is really serious. It's not just there's a bunch of people from Iraq ended up in London and we have to relate to them. There's hundreds of thousands of people going to be here, and a lot of those people will have the same politics we want and want to engage with. So I think that by engaging with them is how we connect up to simply defending the right of refugees to come here and defending the revolutions in those countries, is to make contact with the people themselves and involve them in the kind of political discussions in the way that Miriyam was also suggesting.